All right, let's jump right into this explainer. If you've spent any time digging into ancient history, you know perfectly well that how stories are recorded, passed down, and interpreted, well, it changes absolutely everything. Today, we're basically playing textual detective. We're going to look at the differing testimonies of the final days of Jesus. We'll be looking specifically at how the different gospel accounts present the timeline, the trials, and, crucially, the massive historical ripples these texts caused over the centuries.
So it begs the question, what happens when the most famous testimonies in human history just don't match up? Look, it's super common to assume that ancient biblical texts all tell the exact same story in the exact same way, but when we actually do a critical reading, when we treat them as distinct, separate historical testimonies rather than one big harmonized script, we start to see some incredible, purposeful differences. And to be clear, these aren't just minor typos. We're talking about deeply theological choices made by the authors.
Which brings us right to Exhibit A and B, two tales of one meal.
This is where we hit our first major contradiction. The Synoptic Gospels, that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they all share a pretty similar narrative. They clearly state that this famous Thursday night gathering was a traditional Passover meal, complete with a sacrificial lamb. But then we look at the Gospel of John, an independent account, and it tells a completely different story. In John's version, this isn't a Passover meal at all. It actually takes place before the festival even begins, so there's no sacrificial lamb in sight. Instead, the whole focus of the evening shifts entirely.
During this specific meal in John's account, Jesus does something genuinely shocking. He takes off his outer clothing, wraps a towel around his waist, and just starts washing his disciples' feet. We get this really dramatic back and forth with Peter, who pushes back, basically saying, "No way, you will never wash my feet." And Jesus replies that if he doesn't wash him, Peter has no part with him. Just imagine a major world leader today taking off their shoes and washing the feet of their staff. It was a profound, deeply uncomfortable display of humility. Now in Latin, the word for command is mandatum, which is actually where we get the word mandi. Jesus was giving them a totally new mandate here, to love and serve one another. It's an incredibly moving scene for sure, but it definitely leaves us with a glaring historical puzzle.
So let's take a look at the calendar clash.
Because these two differing meals actually take place on entirely different dates in the Hebrew calendar, where, remember, days begin at sunset. According to the Synoptics, the meal happens on the eve of the 15th of Nisan, which means the crucifixion the very next day happens on the actual Passover holiday. But John shifts this entire timeline back to the eve of the 14th.
Now, why on earth does that matter?
Well, if the crucifixion happens on the 14th, Jesus is on the cross at the exact moment the Jewish people are preparing and slaughtering the Passover lambs. Both accounts are declaring that Jesus is the Passover sacrifice, but they are using two completely contradictory timelines to make that exact theological point. Moving right along into the night, we get to the arrest and the high priest. Following the timeline here, we go from the tension of that meal straight out to the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus asks his disciples, Peter included, to just stay awake and keep watch while he prays. But, the spirit is willing, the flesh is weak, they fall asleep. Soon after, Judas Iscariot shows up with a large, armed crowd sent by the chief priests. Jesus is arrested and dragged away in the middle of the night to the house of the high priest Caiaphas. And this is where the religious leaders have hastily assembled to find some sort of evidence against him.
The whole climax of this religious trial hinges on one specific exchange. They're bringing in all these false witnesses, but honestly, nothing is sticking. Finally, the high priest demands, under oath, to know if Jesus is the Messiah. When Jesus actually replies affirmatively, referencing the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One, the high priest literally tears his own clothes in outrage. He declares that no more witnesses are needed. The charge is blasphemy, which, in their eyes, is a religious offense absolutely worthy of death.
But meanwhile, just outside in the courtyard, this intense human drama is unfolding. Peter, the guy who had boldly claimed he'd rather die than disown Jesus, gets recognized by his Galilean accent. And purely out of panic and fear, he denies even knowing Jesus 3 separate times. Then, exactly as prophesied earlier that evening, the rooster crows. The source text really makes a point to note the absolute devastation of this moment. Peter goes outside and just weeps bitterly. It is such a poignant, raw reminder of the chaotic and truly frightening reality of that night for his followers.
Which brings us to Pilate and the Romans. You see, to actually secure an execution, those religious charges had to be, translated. Pilate, the Roman governor, couldn't care less about a local religious dispute. He absolutely did not care about temple prophecies or claims of blasphemy. What the Roman Empire actually cared about was stability, collecting taxes, and crushing revolts. So, the religious leaders had to frame Jesus as a political threat. The charge had to shift from religious blasphemy over to political treason. They framed him as a man claiming to be the king of the Jews, a direct, undeniable challenge to Roman authority.
And according to the Gospel of Matthew, Pilate publicly washes his hands of the whole situation. He offers to release a prisoner, the crowd chooses Barabbas, and Pilate supposedly declares himself entirely innocent of Jesus' blood. Now, the source lecture suggests this specific presentation might be deeply connected to the politics of the early church. Remember, early Christians were being actively, brutally persecuted by the Romans, so it is highly probable that the early writers really wanted to avoid placing the blame for their founder's death squarely on the Roman Empire. As a result, the texts heavily emphasize Pilate trying to get away from the execution, ultimately just bowing to the insistence of the angry crowd.
And that leads us to the ripple effect, the historical impact and the modern shift.
We really have to objectively look at how this specific interpretation of Pilate's innocence tragically fueled centuries of harsh realities. Step by step, as early theologians compiled and interpreted these texts, that political maneuver to minimize Roman blame resulted in a terrible, terrible shift. The blame for the crucifixion was unjustly placed collectively on the Jewish people. The source analysis points out that this specific framing of the narrative became a harsh excuse for deep animosity and violence between Christians and Jews that literally lasted for centuries. It just goes to show that the way a story is framed can alter the course of history for millions of people. However, the source material also notes a really powerful modern shift. Today, many Western churches are actively changing their interpretive lens. They're engaging in critical reading, finally recognizing the Gospels as distinct historical testimonies with their own specific agendas rather than just straight dictation dropped from heaven. And crucially, they're actively working to remove that historic collective blame from the Jewish people. Instead of pointing fingers, there's a strong movement toward taking shared human responsibility, really adopting an attitude of "it's our fault" to try and heal this profound historical divide.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a provocative thought. We've seen how two differing accounts of a single meal, a shifted calendar date, and the translation of a religious charge into a political one created a narrative that shaped millennia. These texts aren't just dry words on an ancient page, they are the very lenses through which we view our neighbors today. So, how does the way you interpret ancient history shape the reality of your modern world? Keep asking questions, keep looking closely at the sources, and never stop learning.